maybe actually it might be interesting to talk about pseudonymity.
Yeah.
And basically my approach has been when I started, it was like I was coming out of investment banking and went and sort of traveled and was doing a lot of writing. And I just didn't want like my old, associates to be like reading like this, like, everyone in that sort of groupthink world, it's like, what private equity did you go to? It's all like very objective, climbing the ladder. And I just kind of, not only them, but also just like people from my high school or college, like I just wanted a blank slate to be able to write about whatever I wanted to write about, which was mostly new interests, stuff like crypto, philosophical stuff, um, whatever I wanted to do. And so that was sort of like one of the practical reasons for pseudonymity early on. And then separately from that, I've had a bunch of other sort of things that I've attached to it over time. One of which, even from the very beginning, was like, okay, if I'm going to start this sort of like internet profile or account or persona, whatever you want to call it, really it's just me. If I'm going to start that, like I'm aware that the internet can scale like pretty extremely and very fast. And I don't think you need that many followers to get to the point where if you have your headshot as your profile picture and a good portion of your followers are, geographically focused in New York, for example, and that's where you live, like you're gonna have people recognizing you like all the time. Like I'll just pick a random guy like Anthony Pompliano. I don't know how many followers he has. Maybe like he actually probably has a lot. He probably has like a million or something. But someone with like 100,000, like if you're in New York and 30% of your followers are in New York, and you've got 100,000 followers, you've got 30,000 followers in New York. And I just know when I'm walking around New York, I see people, I'm from like sort of that area, not New York City, but, tri-state area. And like I run into people all the time in New York who I know. And how many people do I know from like my real life? It's like a few thousand, maybe. I don't if
Mhm.
that. And so what happens if you 10x that? And then what happens if you like 100x that? And so in a way, it's kind of, um, you could call it sort of cocky to assume from the beginning that you're gonna get a big audience, but I think somewhat in the spirit of hire, which we'll talk about later, like what are you doing if you're not doing something that you expect will be,
Exactly.
big one day? So I'm
Exactly.
curious, how did you start the pseudonymity thing? Like, was that a conscious decision, and how do you think about it today?
Yeah. No, that's great context. And let me just offer a genuine compliment. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. I mean, crypto, though it gets a bad rap in mainstream, I have found the highest density of thoughtful people in my personal experience, which I really appreciate, especially because what we're doing, I feel, is instrumental in human evolution. And to your point about like that could sound somewhat cocky to be thinking about it. I had similar inclinations about pseudonymity. If I'm being fully transparent, um, my history is one of, many faces, maybe is the best way to say it. And, you know, an experimental nature that kind of is pretty much impulsive to a point. There's a 2 year stint of veganism, there's a 2 year stint of bodybuilding, there's a 2 year stint of drug abuse, there's a 2 year stint of criminal behavior. And so I think initially my instinct for pseudonymity was I'd rather just leave my past in the past. I don't
Mm.
really want to deal with um, the bad habit that we've kind of adopted in the internet age of like, let me go find something that was done 7 years ago and punish you for it now because I couldn't punish you for it then. It's like
When did you
I feel
start, by the way? Like,
in crypto.
no, when did you start this, I like this identity,
Oh,
roughly?
Light probably as an identity came about 2020.
Okay. Yeah, so this was
Yeah.
around the same time for me, and I feel like that last reason you mentioned, not to interrupt, but
No, you're fine.
that was like I'm trying to think, like when Trump got elected the first time, 2016, we were at a point where I don't think people were using the word woke very much, but there was
Yeah,
very
it was
clearly
new.
this level of political correctness that was sort of emerging, and then that sort of evolved into, I think, wokeness. And around 2020, which was I created mine, December 2019, um, like of Jake and the blue dot and everything, and it was especially like around that time, obviously years to follow, but this whole thing is sort of like evolving. And it was around that time I think there was like a hypersensitivity to people going back into the archives and finding a way to cancel you. And it was
Hmm.
happening at that time, and it was like completely unapologetic. Like there was no one arguing it. It was like, I mean, people had their thoughts privately, but it was like, oh, yep, that person's canceled. And people
Yeah.
who happened to sort of get got in that era, it's kind of a shame because that cancellation kind of stuck for a lot of them. Whereas now, like the cancellation, and even within the last couple of years, I'd say like the cancellation wouldn't really work anymore. Like there's not enough agreement, there's too much pushback. You can't really cancel people as casually as you could in 2020.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's philosophically with some kind of, soft science mixed in, you know, as I said, I've had many phases of my life where I spend kind of a 2-year stint as a certain personality archetype because it's interesting to me and I find value in some of the things that I practice. And I had a 2-year stint of pre-woke. There wasn't a word for it then, but one of the takeaways I've gotten from that and then watching kind of the woke movement develop and start to kind of crescendo out is I think my most generous read on that dynamic, if I take my own personal experience from it, is that it's a way to try to get some kind of security in the vastness of like this chaotic existence, right? And if we can agree upon via consensus that this is explicitly wrong and this is explicitly right, it lowers a little bit of that existential angst that's always humming
Mm,
underneath everybody. Um, but once I kind of noticed that that was the reason I was doing it, I wanted clear bad guys and clear good guys. Um, I kind of discarded it because I was forced to. I mean, I was the bad guy in a handful of people's story and then face punishment for those things. So it kind of made me feel like, well, I would like redemption, right? I would
mm.
like to be able to learn from this and better myself. And I feel like I've done those things. And so through that process, it kind of made me, relieve myself of that doctrine and that, there's the quote that it's better to be a fool when you're young than you're old. And I definitely agree with that. I'm very thankful that mine was more in youth. Um, but even an old fool, it's like, each day is a new day to redeem yourself if you really want to. So, though I understand the instinct generously, it does feel like it falls short of being constructive.
Yeah, I sort of I take what you're saying on wokeness, and I have some concerns. I would say like I was pretty early averse to what I felt was too much political correctness. Again, like before I think the word woke was being thrown around so much, certainly before it was like perceived widely to be a negative thing. Um, and at the time, I think it's hard to rewind, but I think I was basically observing, my group chats and like the level of, political incorrectness that was going on there.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
not and like and I knew my friends and they're good people.
yep,
But there's jokes. And
yep,
my friends are different races and like whatever. I shouldn't even have to pre-qualify that, but like
yeah, totally.
I'll just say that. Um and so there's off-color jokes like all the
Yeah.
time. And just this level of language that's very different from what was becoming publicly acceptable. And so we had this bar on public conversation that was so high and and yet the conversation that was actually going on in private was, like sort of has been, Trump called it like locker room talk at one point. That's like a decent,
Hmm.
like, shorthand for it. Was getting like actually lower than I would like. Like there was, and
Hmm.
that exists today as well. Like there are jokes that are made and like comments that are made that to me are like a little too much. And like I'm not going to cancel a comedian over it. That's, his job is to make jokes, whatever, I get it. But it's like I would like a little bit more like civility in some contexts. And it's, it's completely context dependent. But and maybe part of this is like, I can only really have the reference of my own lifetime, but my sense is that, 70 years ago, like the equivalent of a group chat, like people talking at a bar would have been like not quite as like edgy,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
more just generally like respectful. And granted, you had like genuine racists more so like back, like, I mean, it's just a different world. But I think like the level of off-colored humor that was like kind of acceptable back then, probably in private conversation. I could be totally off, but I kind of think it was just more civil and respectful potentially. And so seeing that like the private conversations deteriorate to such a level where like anything goes, and then the public threshold just get higher and higher, I was like, something's got to break here because like these people who are pretending that this is an okay line for public, like everyone's just pretending basically.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so eventually we've sort of things have I would say corrected a little bit. And now my concern actually, I said this like, before this recent election, as we're recording this, Trump got elected like 9 days ago. And it's been kind of interesting to see, what's happened since then. But I think even 6 months ago, something like that, I tweeted like, I think we might be at a point where it seems like we're correcting from this, over-indexing on wokeness. And I think we're like either at the point or soon getting to the point where there might be reasonably greater concern that we go like too far in the other direction, based on the momentum of having to like swing the pendulum back from wokeness. And so I don't know how that's all going to play out. And these are like very like meta, human like societal things that it's like hard to even talk about. But I
Totally.
do sort of worry like wokeness, don't get me wrong, like it's like I said, like since the early days it was like very I felt like almost like allergic to it. But
Hmm.
there is, at least a stated desire to like make things good, treat people right. Like, you know, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to go into there, but like there is an idea that it like of goodness to it, but it's just the way that it's sort of implemented is so like not, it's like anti-racism becomes racism or whatever. It's
Yeah.
like all
Yeah.
these sort
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
bad bad ways of implementing. But there is, it is good to not be genuinely racist. It is good to not be
Right.
genuinely sexist,
Right.
like all of these things. And I'm somewhat concerned that in swinging the pendulum the other way, we may actually sort of like produce more genuine racists, more genuine sexists, et cetera.
It's a fascinating point. I don't really get to talk about this topic that much. So, you know, I actually remember when the woke term started getting coined, and if my memory serves, it was a shorthand of the Enlightenment movement reaching the West. I remember when Eastern religions and spiritual doctrines were starting to kind of proliferate in the West online. And I even had my phase of reading as many sacred texts as I could. And wokeness was a shorthand for enlightened, or self-actualized, and they were saying that you were aware, right? You're finally aware, you're enlightened, and it was kind of paired with the psychedelic movements and weed and all that. And I remember woke became the shorthand for kind of like someone who's enlightened. And I remember at the same time there was the movement of like ego death and psilocybin and all these things. And it's only in retrospect that I can really connect dots better than in the moment. And what's interesting to your point about the pendulum swinging is that if I look back at the where wokeness started to veer off, it's actually at the coinage of woke itself, because in a way um, it is a status. It is a taking the status game that we play as humans, right? I'm not going to say that that's necessarily right or wrong. It's just something we do, but it's taking kind of the status game that we play in a consumer capitalist society, where you kind of have to figure out how to organize amongst each other. And it started making this thing of like, I've reached enlightenment. I've reached ego death. I've reached this kind of omnipotent like locality of my consciousness that I'm able to deem something as less than or hellish as opposed to heavenly. And in a way, I think your example of, anti-racism has this weird lean of actually inverting into racism. I think the pendulum swinging toward like troll culture or um yeah, troll culture is probably the best way to label it. I think in a way its initial underpinning is similar to woke's initial underpinning in that it's a conversation about freedom in a way, right? And woke's before woke became woke, it was a conversation about these are kind of the uniquely human rights that should be given to humans when they're free. You should respect them and talk to them properly and kind of that whole sphere of thought. And then I feel that the troll culture um, or the free speech culture, which is it's unfortunate that they've co-opted that word, but kind of that whole sphere of thought is almost the other side of the coin, in my estimation, in terms of yet again saying, um, these are uniquely human rights that should be afforded to people in freedom. They should be allowed to say what they want, even if you don't like it. They should be allowed to express themselves, and here are the reasons. And in a way, I see almost the same pattern again, where it again becomes now status signaling and a status game, and all these things about who can say the most inflammatory thing, who can get away with the most. Um, and it's something that we just do as humans, unfortunately, you know? But um, I guess my naive hope is that each iteration, we at least find one or two insights that are of value that we can take with us as we go to the next iteration. But I definitely see a lot of what you're painting. And to me, it really does feel like the other side of the coin just finally coming back around.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the hope would be if it is sort of natural to humanity that we have this sort of swinging pendulum, and that's just sort of how things balance out over time by going a little too far to one side, a little too far to the other side, back to the middle. And not that things are so bipolar, but
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, if that's sort of a decent symbol for how things work, the hope would be that this pendulum started with like, you know, all the way out and swings all the way to the other side, and then each subsequent swing is like closer and closer to the middle. And maybe you
Mhm.
never get to like a standstill balance in the middle, but these movements from one side to another get like sort of shorter and you get closer and closer to a better balance. And like just generally things are better, which, you know, I don't know enough about like sort of history to assess whether that's something that could be like disproven or supported. But at the very least, like hypothetically, that would sort of align with this idea that, you know, even though we have, you know, two steps forward, three steps, or, you know, two steps, three steps forward, one step back, whatever it's going to be, we are as a human race like progressing. And that would be, I think, like sort of aligned with that visual of like these sort of smaller and smaller pendulum swings. Um, I'm trying to think. I had something else that came up as you were speaking. Well, this is sort of, you know, a little bit of a switching gears, but you talked about these couple of, or actually more than a couple, like three or four different periods, the veganism, bodybuilding, some other things um, that were all like roughly these 2 year stints. And I'm curious if you ever thought about why they were like 2 years. Like, was that sort of this thing that you went into each as like, I'm going to go do 2 years of this thing? Or did they just sort of naturally have their seasons that happened to be 2 years long? Have you ever thought about the actual like sort of duration of these experimentations?
I have, and I may have to stop for a second to get my dog to stop barking. Um, to me, the mental model is very similar to um, romantic relationships, not necessarily pinned in love, right? Like that stat people talk about how like the real fruitful romance relationships are like 2 years, then you kind of deal with the personality of each other. Hold on one sec, Jake. I'm sorry to do this.
No worries.
All right. Sincere apologies about that.
No
Um,
worries. The pros and cons of dog ownership.
oh, I know. And mine, they love to yap. Yeah, so I think the the 2-year model for me is when the romance wears off, when I start to look back at it. And um it's less captivating now because I've done it so many times, but for a long period, it was an existential pursuit, right? And it was I'm a heavily existential leaning person. There are usually never days that ever go by that I don't have like the childlike why questions. And in my younger days, it was very bothersome cognitively. It like really made me uncomfortable that I wasn't able to get these answers and I didn't have like solid footing, I felt. Um, and as I've gotten older, I understand that's more personality type and experiences and all those things, but um, I would pursue something. Uh, I would feel, you know, neurochemicals and external validations or even internal validations, and I would have this romantic surge toward whatever the specific thing was. And so I would just heavily pursue it for like 2 years because I kind of have an obsessive um, personality aspect. And so, like, when I was bodybuilding, it was, live 6 days a week, 3 hours a day. When it was veganism, it was, I think I went from like 220 pounds to 147, and I'm 6'2", so like
Wow.
not healthy, not healthy. And I would just one after another be like, oh, this feels right. Oh, this feels right. Oh, this feels right. And I would just obsess about it for 2 years. And then at the end of the 2 years, I would always have that moment of, um, I think I saw you actually mention this before about words, but I would have the moment of like, at the end of the day, this is a label. This is not like none of this, no substance or material is being human. So I would eventually hit a wall where it was no longer providing me the existential security. And as I did it more and more, I just understood that it's a process I can use constructively if I just allow myself to keep moving on. And so since it's just kind of the thing of, all right, I'm bored with that. What's the next thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've never heard that analogy to like a romantic relationship, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think especially in sort of the ecosystem, whatever the best word is for where we operate, like the internet communities we hang out in, there's a lot of like founders, right? And
Hmm.
typically, I think founding something that you expect to be successful is sort of, known to be a long-term commitment. It's going to take, if you want something to really succeed, it's going to take like on the order of 10 years. And maybe with crypto,
Hmm.
that can be sped up a little bit in some sense, but in other senses, maybe it actually even takes longer for the full, like for something like, Ethereum to like fully succeed to its potential is going to be longer than a decade. Um, and I tend towards what you're describing, I would say, in terms of like I've done just so happens to be, or maybe not just coincidence, maybe partially for some of these reasons you're describing, but less unbeknownst to me, that I've sort of done these roughly 2 year stints in a bunch of different things which don't really necessarily connect to one another,
Hmm.
because they're all independently interesting. And then I sort of fall out of love, or the romance of them stops. And I think I've actually somewhat consciously thought about this in the context of romantic relationships where like I, recently got married, have been in a relationship for like going on 6 years. And at some point, I think I sort of consciously identified that in my work life, I like to have these, you know, more of these 2 year stints. And in my romantic life, I wanted to have not that. Like doing both at the same time seemed to be too much. Like these are two very fundamental parts of life, right? Like your work life and your
Hmm.
partner, so to speak. And I was like, I want to commit to a long-term partnership and relationship on that side of things. And then I feel like in doing that, I'll have like the stability there to have this very weird work life that is
Mhm.
atypical for most people who I would say have, even if they're changing jobs every 1 to 3 years or whatever it is, they're staying in like a similar career, most people. They might, go from doing sales in one industry to sales in another, or sales in one industry to product management in that same industry. Like there's tangential moves, but there's not like, you know, investment banking to podcasting,
Right.
or to your point, like, veganism to carnivorism. Like not a ton of people are making those shifts. And I think it's an interesting way to live. And one of the things I've been thinking about recently as it pertains to crypto is that I think this sort of like archetype is either I've just found a bunch of these people on the internet. I think you saw actually a cast I put out the other day, which was how many people have, I forget the exact criteria, but it was like how many people have a certain percentage of their net worth in crypto and have been technically unemployed for the majority of the last 4 years or something like that.
Mhm.
And like that, it's like a very simple criteria. It's like basically unemployed for a good percentage of your overall time in the last few years and have had the majority of your money in crypto for a good percentage of the last few years. And if you take those two things, it's like I sense the connection between them because I think part of what's going on is anyone who's been invested in crypto to date, their money that's been invested in crypto, as long as they haven't, done anything silly, if they've just kind of like held Bitcoin for a simple example, it's at whatever 90,000 today. And a few years ago it topped out at 60,000, but before that it was 20. And it's just gone up
Mhm.
multiples every few years for 15 years. And so anyone who entered at any point has sort of been financially attached to this thing that it doesn't go up, 5 or 10% per year like you might expect of like investing in an index of the stock market. It's like this whole different ball game of like multiples every few years. And if you can be either, delusional enough or correct enough to count on that. If you believe in something, you believe in Bitcoin and you think that this is, you can even be reasonable like I am and be aware that all of this could kind of come crashing down at any time. I still don't rule out the
Yep.
possibility that even Bitcoin and Ethereum, crash 80% from where they are now and never really recover.
Totally. Yeah.
And so you can be aware of that, but you can still choose to believe, well, I think, odds are this is actually going to continue to increase in multiples. And if you have a real belief there and like money, people want to make money, people want to be financially secure. It's a pretty important, like fundamental thing to think about. It's arguably why most people work. Um, and so if you have that sort of like fundamental belief that the majority of your money is invested in this thing that you expect to go up multiples every year, suddenly you have this freedom to do whatever you want to do.
Yep.
Or at least if you minimize your cost relative to that amount. But no longer do you need, $2.5 million to get 100K per year to live on. You could theoretically have like $150,000. And if you just sort of don't spend too much and it keeps going up multiples every year, like you can live on that. So like in a way, financial freedom, quote unquote, is attainable at like a much lower level that you can get to for like, people who start out with good jobs out of school or whatever, you can get there in like your 20s. Um, which just didn't used to be the case unless you got
Yeah.
like really lucky or did something truly outstanding. And so that's producing, I think, a class of people who are doing more of these couple years experiments. It doesn't necessarily need to make money. You can just kind of follow what you want to do. And I don't know how that develops, but it seems that there's more people who are more like me in that sense. And you're certainly one of them.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that rings real true to my instincts. And I've been recently playing with this model of pre-digital and digital. And, pre-digital life ended essentially in the 90s. And if you want to speak more of like, I guess, mainstream adoption, early 2000s, right? And um, as such, there's kind of two thoughts here, but they tie together. One, I'm of the opinion that the human race is still highly underdeveloped. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean that there's just so much room to go. And then simultaneously, that the internet is like a baby.
Yeah.
Um, and some of the things you're talking about, they feel so true to me. One, because I live them, as do you. And then two, you know, the inefficiencies of offline are numerous, right? And it's amazing that we actually are able to have gotten so much done with it. And I remember I was listening to Sadhguru talk recently, and he was asked, you know, essentially about like the bad side of phones. And he's kind of a smug character, so he took joy out of the question and then kind of just was like, no, I love this thing. I wake up in the morning and I'm able to get things done all over the world in an hour that would take me months or years, or I would never be able to get them done if I didn't have it. And, if you extrapolate that and you think about what the internet is, what it's affording those of us who are kind of at the front edge of it, um, it just seems to me, and to your point, kind of have to hedge it in that anything can happen and you can always be reset, hard or soft. But it just seems like our understanding of macroeconomics offline do not map to online. And there's a very easy anecdote at the currency level, right? Which is that fiat paper on the internet is essentially an IOU, while crypto is like, in a way, all currency is an IOU, but I'm sure you know kind of what I'm pointing at, and that crypto is like it's in my wallet, I hold it, it's accessible. And if payments and paymasters become um, more norm, then it really is less of an IOU than saying that there's one United States dollar on the computer. But where was I going with that? Yes, the macroeconomics online are really not one to one offline, it feels. And as such, it feels like it's revealing this whole other dimension of humanity where money flowing and value attribution is not something that is hard coded to utility based products and services only,
Mm.
but instead is this communal relationship of humanity, you know, drafting attention and resources toward things that it just values. And in the same way that it's very hard to beat sitting around a campfire with the friends you've grown up with for decades, um, compared to a Lamborghini. Like these things are not equitable. And I feel like offline macroeconomics are very much about finding equitable thresholds and baselines from which you can scale back to, in a way, and I hate to do this. I notice sometimes I kind of keep returning to the same point, but it feels prescient here. To me, that feels very existential angst, reduction and based, right? Of like X plus Y equals Z. If I plug this into an offline market, I get XYZ. And online, it's starting to reveal, at least so far, that that's not really the only way humans value things. And human value itself, allowed to roam freely across the globe, is very much interested in beauty, very much interested in connection, very much interested in ideas and evolution and all these things that don't really neatly fit into a product or service cardboard box. Um, and so you know, that is really one of the strongest underpinnings of my belief in what we're doing here in crypto, and why I feel like the risk of it all imploding is worth it for me.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that resonates back at me, and especially just the high level point on the internet being basically a baby. I think for people who, generally share our perspective on crypto, it seems that the internet pre-crypto could, in retrospect, look like this tiny little blip, like a an exception that was like very soon figured out that like why are we not using internet native currency or internet native money or internet native, why don't we have internet native value um, as these things develop? And it's why it's hard to kind of imagine the upside on these things. Um, and when you talk about like sort of the macroeconomics not lining up digital to physical, I've got this concept and sort of a related concern that um, that like you look at something like nuclear energy or AI, and you can pretty clearly see like, okay, there's like real tangible value. Like if these things start working really well, energy will be cheaper. Uh, People can leverage AI, and we won't need people to do these like lower level jobs, and abundance is around the corner, like all these sorts of things. Um, and with crypto, I think there's value creation in like a very different way. I think there is that type of value creation that like people are genuinely creating useful things
Mhm.
within crypto, but then there's this other that's like most clearly sort of demonstrated by like meme coins, which is it's it doesn't need to necessarily create value, but crypto um, sort of exposes value where it already existed but couldn't be quantified. So, for example, like your friend sitting around the fire example, a Lamborghini has a quantifiable value. Your friend sitting around the fire, like there's not
Right.
money changing hands, like you can't really like pay for that. Um, and so it's like how much value already exists in the world, which just doesn't have a market for it yet. And that I think is like, if you start thinking about that, it's like crypto could be so valuable, not because it's necessarily creating a ton of value, but because it's putting prices on things that previously didn't have prices
Yeah.
by making markets for them. And so I don't know how all of that plays out. And the related concern is basically, okay, if this sort of just putting price tags or value, in monetary terms on all of these things starts to really explode, you've already got like Dogecoin at whatever it is. I could be wrong, but like somewhere on the order of like 20 to 40 billion dollar market cap.
Mhm.
And like compare that to companies that are worth 20, 40 million dollars, like or 20, 40 billion, excuse me. They're like doing so much. Like there are
Yep.
so many
Yeah.
people organized, like doing hard things that to produce products that generate revenue, which are more than the expenses. And, so you have profits and then there's a market cap based on people doing what's the equity worth versus the profits for this company. And like, what happens to all of those things which are producing, real material things that people need, like farmers and whatnot,
Okay. Yeah.
medicine, whatever. Like, what happens to all of that when the rewards don't require that like physical labor and that physical production? And I think an optimistic view could be that like maybe we get kind of lucky and AI and automation and robotics sort of come online at the same time as crypto. And so we have like all of this value that's coming online, and we don't need people to continue to be motivated on some of the other things because we suddenly have like AI and robots that can sort of manage to get everyone enough food and, whatever sort of these basics are that people might be less incentivized to work on in the future. So I don't really know. It's a very sort of high level thing, but that's like this general view I have on crypto that so far, I mean, seems to be playing out. We're getting further and further removed from real things needing to be tied to the value. Maybe I shouldn't say real, but like, physical product or even digital product or
Hmm.
things with utility. And we're just, creating value out of thin air. And on the one hand, that seems maybe dumb, but on the other hand, it's real. Like people, it wouldn't have the value that it does if people didn't value it because there's a market and people would sell at the higher price if they didn't believe that value was really there.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting to watch it all unfold.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've actually been thinking about this recently, serendipitously enough. And, you know, I guess I'm being optimistic. I should preface before I even start saying things. But there's a part of me that feels that. an internet that has its own native financial system would best be used as another layer on the stack of human civilization, right? I think there's some crypto people I speak with, and they have a kind of vengeful streak to them about their own nation state governmental systems and kind of this desire to see it all crumble and they get to be at the top of the heap.
Right.
Um, and kind of to your point, you know, the farmer didn't do anything to you. Why does he deserve to have his whole life uprooted because you don't like the United States government? Um, so my optimistic hope is that as it comes further and further online, there are, you know, two layers. There's the person who isn't necessarily internet inclined and they do whatever they do offline. And hopefully, with AI and robotics, they have their own new edge to increase their capacity to earn and produce. And then simultaneously, there's this internet that's global and distributed, and anybody in a nation state can plug into that and operate there as well. And if that were to happen, I feel like we get more of a rising tide type scenario. Um, Additionally, um, I one of my 2 year stints was traveling the world a lot, and I think I went to 4 or 5 continents and like 20 or something countries in that stint. And um, the ones that really stand out to me are Moscow, Russia, Havana, Cuba. I went to the 3 cities in Vietnam, and then Marrakesh, Morocco. And what all of those kind of stood out to me were some amalgamation of like the differences of nation state government practices and how they influence their societies, but also just the vast difference in what the US has accomplished thus far versus some of these nations that have been around longer, and how the internet really is an American thing in terms of like its acceleration thus far. And to me, I go kind of to your Doge point, we're probably right in that there are going to be some major players that get wiped down 90% or 100% and never come back. And part of me speculates internally that right now, this is the idea of the internet psyoping us, the humans. Like we're psyoping ourselves into realizing the value and the opportunity. And as such, we will help develop it. And through that, I hope that the internet gets to reach further and further into all corners of the world, in which case it again would be a rising tide to quality of life and human mobility and capacity. Because there's some stories that I've gotten from my travels where, not to get grim, but the one that really stands out is in Vietnam in this woman's home. And she's talking to me about people she knows selling their children because they needed money. And I mean, essentially, sex slavery is what she was talking about, and how, they would charge $1,000, but because it's a black market, they would get $100. And so it was this like profound moment of like $100 for a human life. Like I don't think I'll ever forget it. And to me, the internet doesn't all of a sudden solve sex trafficking. That's not what I'm trying to say, but um, you do go the opportunity that the internet affords at the ownership level is something that seems so unique and like a real paradigm shift that I wonder how much of like this not correlated market to value production is really just us incentivizing ourselves to actually build the real thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things that first got me into Bitcoin, really the thing that sort of made it click for me was this talk by this guy Andreas Antonopoulos. He was talking about how it's hard to explain Bitcoin to people in America, but you don't have to explain it to people in Venezuela.
Right, right.
Their currency gets hyperinflated. They have, some amount of money in the bank, and then, you know, weeks later or whatever, it's worth half as much, or don't quote the exact numbers, but it's actually insane. And I think the ability for anyone around the world to plug in to the internet for the cost of a mobile phone and Starlink soon, or maybe now, is genuinely crazy. And so that use case of people just being able to, take the money that they've earned and put it in an asset that's not controlled by their
Mhm.
government without their government being able to do anything about it was kind of the first thing that I was like, okay, that makes a ton of sense. Because in the US, people talk about inflation and maybe we have a out of control inflation situation that does arise. But right now, the type of inflation that we're talking about is just like nothing compared to,
Right.
Venezuela or Turkey or some of these other countries that have experienced like true hyperinflation. Um, and so yeah, when you're talking, it really like it's just this interesting thing that really has this potential to give everyone around the world opportunities similar to those that people in America have,
Mhm.
even though historically countries have been so different from one another in terms of like the opportunities afforded them, where that situation that you mentioned in Vietnam is just like pretty unimaginable here.
Right.
There's just not really like there's enough of a foundation and like a worst case scenario prevention that just doesn't really happen in America. And so ideally, just as America has been able to make that worst case scenario not as bad for people here, the internet could make the worst case scenario not as bad for people around the world. I think even if you can't, or if I can't exactly explain how that might work, I think it's a reasonable thing to be somewhat optimistic about.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, I want to it'd be a shame if we didn't touch on hire, which
Oh
is
yeah.
how
Yep.
you and I got associated in the first place. I discovered hire like surprisingly late. I was not a part of the channel like at the time of the airdrop. Not even, months had passed after that, I think, before I really started paying attention. It was sort of peripherally on my radar as something that I just kind of assumed was like price go up meme, which is a
Yeah.
pretty good meme in and of
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
And then over time, I started to see like, okay, these people who are, casting about this, and for people who aren't on Farcaster, might lose some context on some of this stuff, but I don't think it's really worth, trying to make it like completely legible to someone off Farcaster. Like we can assume a little bit of context, but basically, um, it's this, it's a channel, it's a bunch of things combined into one. But what I started noticing was concretely like seeing people posting in this channel, and what I was seeing was like this aesthetic that I was loving, and this optimism and ambition and positivity in a very different from like sort of maybe like the woke enlightened way, and
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
so just like we're just trying to get better and do better and go higher. And I was like, I love this. And it also it's not separate from price go higher. Like we also want, you
Yep.
know,
We want price going higher.
yeah, we
We
want
want
price
that.
going higher. But I started really to appreciate the community in a way that I hadn't resonated with any really crypto community or meme coin or anything like that prior. And so maybe we can just touch on sort of the origin story, because I think a lot of people are like me, that they sort of came on board later on after that interesting, first part of the thing's inception had already come and gone. And so I'd be
Hmm.
curious to hear like the uh the precursors for creating higher, just the origin story, and then we can touch on maybe some details from there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have over an hour, by the way. So if we need to run over, that's totally fine with me.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So, well, ironically enough, we actually have touched on more of the pre-context than I've ever touched on before in parts of this conversation. And to your point about the optimism not being wokeness, I'm sure kind of in hindsight, it makes sense why it has that slant. Um, so my personal fascination with memes, to me, this will all hopefully make sense together. But to me, Kind of the things we talked about with the internet and all that, and it being a baby. If since I work from that starting point, to me, memes are digital linguistics, and I have it is one of the only things that I've done the 2 year stint, and it has not gone away yet. I have just continued to pursue memes and memetics as a field. And to me, memes are, like I said, a language, a conversation format for this new globally distributed web. And um, in 2020, maybe, I was living in Fort Lauderdale and I was just kind of taking a break and a hiatus from everything. And I had these whiteboards all around my place. And I wrote Meme 101 on the board and just kind of went down the Richard Dawkins thing and all of that to figure out what the hell, a meme is. And it's led into what I just articulated prior. And so as such, I'm always looking for interesting ways or better ways to have a conversation that I want to have, right? And memes to me do that better than anything I've found. And in the bull posting channel on Farcaster, which Six started, we were just bull posting, having fun. And simultaneously, I was following Web3 Quant on Twitter, and he always ended his tweets if he was doing like a bull post with higher. And it made me feel way better than it should have, honestly. Like for some reason, seeing at the end higher was like existentially comforting, right? To kind of play into the themes of the conversation we're having here. And so I'm very attuned to my own sensitivity. So if something really starts to like hook in my brain, I will examine it thoroughly to figure out why. Um, and then part of this persona that I've built up through pseudonymity has kind of afforded me the opportunity to just make that a part of the brand itself, is that I get to examine myself as a test subject and then figure out how to articulate that as just like scientific anecdotes at large. And the higher thing just kept hooking me. And I had a day where or I had a couple days where price volatility was just going crazy, and I was in some like pretty risky bets. And the day that it was really going up was also the day that my personal life was kind of chaotic. I take care of a 93-year-old grandmother with dementia, and she's strong-willed, so there's all kinds of complicated stuff there. But so it was like this day of my personal life was kind of irritable, but my portfolio was really going well. And I kind of just had this serendipitous moment of like, man, it's crazy how much more emotionally resistant I am when the price is higher. And that led me to posting in the Bull Post channel. And I think people have this cast saved of like when price is higher, negativity bounces off you easier, you're in a better mood, and et cetera, et cetera. And I just said at the end of it, higher can be a conscious mental model then. Like I could just, I don't need to be relying on price. I could just use this actually in my life if it's a valuable meme. And so then I was talking to Jacob at Zora. He liked the idea as well. He suggested the arrow as a Unicode because at the time on Farcaster, finding Unicodes was like nerdy and fun at the moment. So I took his advice, used the arrow, minted it, made a collection where I kind of went through the aesthetic ideation. I think it was like 40 posts or something. Made the channel, made Six a co-host, and we just started casting about higher. I didn't really have any other thoughts beyond that, honestly. I was just fascinated with the idea. Martin saw it quickly thereafter, resonated with it, and come to find out he's written posts years ago, essentially as like a framework of what he would be looking for in a nouns iteration. And so in hindsight, it's very clear that he saw it and it checked all the boxes he'd been thinking about. So he launched the token, and he did it really generously in terms of airdropping it to everybody who was in the channel and not really trying to make it something more than that. And I just saw the like reception people were having, and kind of back to the scientific like meme point. Um, I've been iterating on various memes for the past couple of years, and they would get some traction, some not. The response I got from Hire was undeniable. And so to me, it was tied into some of the broader conversations we had about the internet. To me, it was like, I've said to many people, it feels like the market wants this thing. Like this feels like something that's not um, from Light or Six or Martin or Jacob. This is something that like back to value creation. This is something that seems valuable to humans at large and something that it wants to see manifest. And so as such, ever since I had that idea or realization, I should say, I was just like, all right, cool, let's chase it. Let's see what can come about.
So you had this bit in one of your essays that I read that was talking about how you'd previously been a part of, a few different
Mhm.
like crypto communities, decentralized organizations, whatever you might call them. And you wrote about this concept of like there's this intense adoption mania followed by intense adoption exodus. And that
Yep.
seems to be, sort of if not the one of the critical issues that every crypto product has to, or crypto community or crypto anything has to deal with, or really beyond crypto, just anything on the internet. The nature of it is that it's going to either it's going to do nothing or it's going to do a lot. It's going to attract a ton of attention. And then that attention is going to dissipate as fast as it came. Or it's going to do something maybe more like a CryptoPunks or
Mhm.
even a Bitcoin, you could argue, where, it comes out to little fanfare and then over time, like a long period of time, starts to gain more and more attention. So without that sort of like successful launch, it builds over time. Um, but it seems fairly rare to like have something that has that big, out of all the things that capture a ton of attention at launch, very few of them are able to persist and sustain anything close to sort of like the launch level of attention. And so higher at the launch of the channel, again, I wasn't really around at this point, but it seems that just based on the price, at least of the higher token, that around the time of the channel's inception and the token, which launched soon after, there was this, wild amount of attention that came to it, which reflected in the price of hire. I think it
Mhm.
had like $100 million market cap, something like that.
Yep.
How did you, coming off of these previous experiences where you've seen the rise and fall, presumably, more than once, how did you sort of handle, okay, this really struck a chord, but um, the likely outcome just based on previous experiences and what you've seen in the market is like that attention goes as fast as it came. How did you sort
Mhm.
of deal with that? And then we're sort of at an interesting point now, I feel like, where, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like the last month or so, especially with like Ethernet and now the price, of the token is, considerably higher. I don't know if it's like back to where it started, but it's close, I think.
Yep.
It seems like this is sort of like the second the return of attention, among other things.
Yep.
And but I got into it in the valley basically between
Yep.
these spikes. And so I saw like it wasn't like there was nothing going on. There were the people who were into it were really into it. The posting about it was obviously not related to price because the price was like 95% down.
Right. Right.
And so there was it's not like it died by any means. But it's still nice. I think the hardest thing after the first, it's hard to have a successful launch. And then the hardest thing after that is to have like a sort of a second spike in attention. And then the hardest thing after that is to have a third. And eventually it's sort of
Mhm.
these spikes get less spiky and you have a thing that is persistent. But that's like a non-trivial thing to accomplish. Have you been sort of conscious in trying to counter that like sort of natural thing that seems to happen to these projects in crypto and on the internet? Or have you just kind of done your best and, said like, whatever happens, happens?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a mix of it, honestly. To the first part of your question, part of the reassurance like foundation I had was that founders of projects that are successful in the space currently, um, and I won't name them so that people don't think I'm trying to chase for clout, but people that I respect and have working relationships with that have things that are successful that do millions of dollars and they have tons of people in the employ, all really like hire, um, and have conversations with me about it or publicly. And so to me, that was like a sign early that my intuition about what we had uncovered was actually what we had uncovered. And then when the attention exodus left, I think at the peak, Saintless said we were down 97% from the top, and we were there for like 4 or 5 months, maybe. Um, the conscious part of me combating that was I had this realization early in hire that it would only be successful if we embodied the meme and kind of how um, picking an ambitious, optimistic, like collective type meme, such as hire, is very much a high risk, high reward type of pursuit. And that one of the easiest critiques for it ever will be that it's a positivity grift or that it's not genuine about trying to actually do what it says it does. And this is in part why I believe so many meme coins that launch make an explicit statement about that they do nothing. And it's very similar to the 2021 mania of NFT projects where they were like, stop doing roadmaps. Um, just say you do nothing. And Hire's not that. So I had this realization that the only way Hire had any chance whatsoever is if the core people at the top embodied the ethos so that people could genuinely see it was not a positivity grift and that we really did mean it was what it was about. So the way I've combated that was as soon as I saw the price drop, it was very clear to me that that was now the opportunity to prove that I wasn't bullshitting about what I meant. And, to anybody who ends up listening to this, hopefully the earlier parts of this conversation gave more context to why um, I felt so convicted in that. Because to me, if the internet is a baby and all that, then things like Hire and NounsDAO are free floating infrastructure for that global coordination. And, I can't help the lady who sold her child for $100, but I can help the people that are here on the internet. And not as if like I'm some patriarch or matriarch type figure to them, but more so what I see as a possibility is at least attemptable, right? It's not guaranteed to succeed or fail, but it's something that you can try right now. We have crypto composability. We have people with smartphones and laptops. We have the ability to launch ERC20s and create channels on Farcash and all these things. So when the price went down, to me, it was really just an opportunity to separate ourselves as a community from um, faux marketing and instead be like, okay, price went down. That doesn't change at all the ethos of what this whole thing is about. And I feel like the price going back up now and kind of stabilizing at that range is proof that we at least passed the first test. Um, it feels like soon we will see the token break previous all-time highs, and then it'll have its attention exodus again. And then that'll be, the second test of having to kind of prove that no, we are still about going higher.
Yeah, and I think the easiest sort of precedent to point to, it's in a very different way, but with Bitcoin, it's like it's had I don't know how many now,
Mhm.
rip through the all-time high and then crash down to maybe less than the previous all-time high and sit there for years and
Yeah.
then make its climb back up. And sort of a tangent, but part of my wondering with Bitcoin, I generally agree, what you said at the very top of the conversation around like the people who I've encountered who are into crypto just tend to be, very thoughtful and interesting. Obviously, there's like different parts
Right.
of the crypto world, but the pocket that we're in, which is like not, I mean, it is small, but it's big enough as a percentage of like people who are into crypto, I think. And so it's basically a lot of very thoughtful, very smart people would have to be very wrong for crypto
Right.
to kind of just fizzle out. Um, and that's something, and given my own sort of belief in it for reasons beyond just other people thinking so, um, it feels like, sort of a lifetime bet, like
Yeah.
a once in a lifetime bet to be able to make, a once in a lifetime sort of ride to decide to get on. And I guess you talk about like sort of passing the first test. So Bitcoin, we could say, has passed, I don't know, six, seven, eight, nine tests.
Mhm.
And the question that I still have is especially with Bitcoin, which sort of is, I think at this point it's very simple. It's digital gold.
Yep.
It's not really trying to be anything else. Like Ethereum to me is still very, very difficult to explain. Um, because while it has like revenue generation, it the value of it seems to be a large portion of it is based on sort of ETH money.
Right.
And when you mix the two, when you mix these things, then it's like, and it's not just digital gold. It's like, well, what percentage of Ethereum's value is Ethereum as a meme coin almost?
Hmm.
And what percentage of it is because it's actually a useful piece of infrastructure? And so the thing that I wonder with all of crypto, but with Bitcoin sort of leading the way, is what is the true like limit here? If we're right that the internet is a baby and that the future of the internet is, increasingly crypto,
Hmm.
or, built on crypto rails, then, the upside could be sort of like unlimited. But, and so it's like so far, each test like that has been passed, it's like it's passing another test, passing another test. It's now passed enough tests where the market cap is like $1.5 trillion, which is
Right.
roughly like one of the most like equal to one of the most valuable companies in the world. I think it just passed silver, which is sort of like the second,
Yeah.
metal behind gold. And so it's like it's gotten to that level. Um, can it go beyond the most valuable company in the world? Can it get to gold? Can it go beyond gold? Is it something that's bigger than gold because people who invested in gold were more so nation states and sophisticated investors and less just like everyday people? Like I look around me and I have maybe like a friend or two who owns gold, and almost all of my friends have at least a piece in Bitcoin. And these aren't
Mhm.
crypto people. These are people from like my prior life. And granted, part of it is because maybe I've influenced them in some ways, or they've been influenced by people like me in their lives. But if you look around and you see like, well, kind of everyone seems to have a piece of this thing, then the upside could be far beyond that. And so, that's what I think a lot of us, and I don't need to even think about that. I think of the upside being gold. That's plenty. That's multiples from where it
Right.
is now. But I do sometimes wonder, like, how would we know if and when we approach a level that is just like, okay, that's how valuable this thing actually is in the world? And
Mhm.
like, we could, I'm not saying we are, I don't believe that we are, but we could potentially be there. And that limit, could exist for anything. It's not to say that it's like a hard limit, like it's not going to move, like it can go down and up. But the volatility on Bitcoin compared to the market cap is just so insane.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and you see, Tesla is like kind of another, Tesla's been pretty volatile at a pretty huge market cap. And I don't know if it's just anecdotal, like I haven't really done, research on this, but it seems like volatility is increasing,
Yeah.
especially in these large assets, which were previously like my senses. You wouldn't see double digit percentage moves in a day. And with Bitcoin, like happens all the time.
Yep.
Can double in a week at like $1 trillion market cap. And so I feel like when the volatility is that high at such a high market cap, it sort of implies that the thing needs to go a lot higher that in order for the
Yep.
volatility to come down. And so that's more of what I mean by like this ceiling. It's not like a fixed ceiling, like it's never going to move. It's just like, when is this thing, if you have something that goes from zero to $10 trillion in value, it can't take a straight path because at a certain point, if something's doubling every year or whatever it is, people are going to get the hint and they're going to invest and they're going to get overly excited and it's going to go
Mhm.
too high for the moment and then crash down. And that's basically been Bitcoin's path to date. Um, and so given that you can't take this like sort of straight path and you have to take this volatile path, it's like when does that volatile path start simmering off and we sort of approach the point at which like, okay, this is kind of how valuable this thing is in the world. And similarly with
Mhm.
hire, um, not to, as a significant tangent, but coming back to hire, it's like I think it's fair to say like we have no idea what that's worth because
Right.
it's basically, I mean, you do a better job of summarizing it than me, but it's like not, and this is a pretty horrible sort of comp, but if like woke had a coin, like how high would that have gone? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, like pretty high. And so higher is in a way its own sort of doctrine or philosophy, whatever you might call it, among other things. And what is that philosophy worth in the world to everyone in the world who is able to access it? It's hard to
Yeah.
say that like, you can't
Yeah.
really put a limit on that upside, right?
You really can't. At least that's in my opinion as well. I mean, there's a couple things I'd love to highlight there, if we have the time, is like um, the your point about Bitcoin, right, is kind of like a conversation about when does this actually become consensus as a commodity, like for humanity. And I do feel that there's so much further to go because I was just talking to Six earlier today about, the internet is the baby thing, and then even the people that are online, most people still operate at the read level, and then less operate at the write level, like YouTubers and all that, and then even less operate at the own level. And if we're right as an industry, then it feels like if Bitcoin is to become the internet reserve currency for all the rest of the things that we do on the internet, and the internet is a baby, then it does feel like maybe some of those Bitcoin maxis and whales that talk about multi-million per Bitcoin isn't as far-fetched as it sounds at first take. And then, Ethereum definitely kind of as a community, not necessarily like their core devs and all that, but as a community struggles over their narrative and their meme somewhat. And to me, Ethereum is um, not money but compute. And the world computer kind of idea to me is what is the most romantic to me about Ethereum. And in that regard, things like Hire, even on the base itself, are computer programs in a way for the world computer. And for Hire specifically, um, the way I would articulate it to someone who maybe isn't up on all the context is, um, I think actually Martin really worded this well. It was like, what is like, can we create a globally distributed brand and network that like people can just plug to your point earlier about having a phone and having Starlink? Like, can we create a internet destination that people can come to plug into the value of the next iteration of the internet? And then the second part of that question is, if so, what is that worth? And so I think the brand and the aesthetic and the channel and all of that are the first part of the question, and the token is the second part of the question. And, I believe that if we can figure it out enough to grow beyond our purview, that the value is immense, not just for the token, but for the industry at large. The way like Seneca and Noun 40 over at Nouns are excited about Hire, to me, like really signals to me that we are trying to iterate on the principle they laid down. And if we can iterate on it and find something out, that should provide space for someone else to come and iterate and figure it out. And the more of these networks that populate and actually can scale an individual's agency and opportunity and capacity, the better the internet is and the better, people are. I know it's again kind of cocky to say that, but to me, um, hire really is about like, can we globally increase human capacity? And if we can, to me, that seems incredibly valuable, and people should have a way to own some of the upside in building that, which I think the token does at the moment.
Right. So, last couple of questions I want to touch on. Hopefully, we started with I forget what exactly, but like this existential stuff and,
Mhm.
very the conversation I would describe as pretty deep, pretty
Yeah.
pretty conceptual, and it's been great. But to maybe end on more of a easier to talk about subject, I guess. I have a
Mhm.
couple of questions about specific things. One, the first is the latest development in Hire, which is H Combinator.
Mhm.
And I may fail in my attempt to bring things to concrete because I'm sure that is, not as it's easy at face value to say, okay, Y Combinator for Hire, but I'm sure it's a little more complex than that. So I'd like to talk about that. And then after that, I just want to go completely off topic and hear a little bit about the walking club, but maybe we'll start with
Oh,
H
beautiful.
Combinator.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, to your point, H Combinator is kind of tongue-in-cheek Y Combinator for hire. Part of the, to get more like material to your point and less conceptual, part of the struggles I've had with my part of the stewardship of hire has been um, getting the people that I really respect their skill set and thinking to do more than just say that they resonate with hire. And we had a couple standouts like um, Martin with Aether and the token itself, honestly. Um, Alexandra or Kagusha.eth with higher athletics and getting people to like do run clubs all around the world and sponsoring higher athletes and all this. And then Chic Bangs.eth, who started, Higher FM, this radio station with a UFO club where she has people on to talk about kind of the philosophical aspects of the network and the network participants. And then Jihad with a Believe in Something, which is very like narrative focused and giving micro grants and mentorship to people that kind of fall into his taste profile. We've struggled since the initial pullback to really find more people to step up and actually build things. And I was having a conversation the other day about, they said, what are the metrics that we can point to show progression? Because token is kind of more of a lagging indicator. And my instinct was to say startups found it, right? To
Mm,
me, higher successful, the more I see people create their own job and it becomes successful. And it's been really hard to bridge that just off narrative and like community engagement alone. And so I was actually talking to Aether yesterday, our AI agent, excuse me, to anybody who's not familiar, created by Martin. And there's a whole conversation there about what AI agents can do, but put that aside and stay with the concrete. I was talking to Aether about this problem. I was saying, we're kind of set up in this weird territory where um, extracting value and returning value is like a very misbalanced equation, and it's more like 30 to 1. And I would like it to be closer to 3 or 2 to 1. And he didn't give me the exact idea I wanted, but he definitely gave me the seed. And H Combinator is an attempt at solving this problem I've just articulated of um, I know people in the network have been gracious enough to verify my opinions and philosophy on what hire should be or what it can be, rather. And so, as such, I feel like part of my contribution is probably best targeted at finding those members who maybe are shy or intimidated or they know they have an idea but they don't know how to articulate it or turn it into system. And so, uh, sticking with the internet ethic, which is like quick and short in, short out, I go, rather than doing some multi-month or year thing, why don't we set up like 1 week sprints where we take, the identified contributor archetypes, which are visual creatives, software developers, and multimedia creators. Why don't we just actually set up 1 week sprints where we take a certain amount of them and help them internalize the concept, help them figure out a system that they can use after that week to start working toward making their own career. How can we get them a little piece of proof of work to take with them as the first nugget? And then how can we get them to refer other people of other disciplines so that we can keep doing it? And my hope is that we accelerate the higher athletics, FM, Aether, um, and really just like create a strong stable of core contributors themselves that uh, don't have to figure out all these concepts we've outlaid like by themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a natural extension as a next thing to do, as like sort of a the best thing for you to be doing, like you said.
Yeah,
And I think this you mentioned earlier in our conversation around just like what Hire could do worldwide. I forget your exact words, but roughly just like making humans able to reach higher,
yeah,
for lack of a better word, and just sort of like seize more of their potential, perhaps. And this is something I've always thought about is like at the highest level of value, like if you can increase people's ability to capture and accomplish more of their potential, achieve more of their potential. And that's not just obviously monetary, but that's people's potential, sort of however, according to whatever definition of success they have for themselves.
right.
So that can be family oriented, that can be art oriented, that could be business building, anything. And Y Combinator, some could argue has done that for a relatively small segment of the world that's obviously been wide reaching in its impacts. But there's probably a fair number of people who went into Y Combinator and succeeded largely. Like I'm not sure how many of the super well, actually I can point to one, which is Brian, founder of Coinbase.
Mhm.
He was with Airbnb and had already, he had tried doing startups previously, didn't have much success, was at Airbnb, was finally doing quite well. Like Airbnb was a very successful startup already, but this was like very early. I think he was like, you know, under employee, like under 100, something like that. And he probably was like comfortable enough, I'm not like trying to speak on his behalf or anything, but like he was probably like doing well enough and comfortable enough that if he didn't have a little nudge or a push to do something else, like he like
Mhm.
basically a little nudge might have made the difference between him continuing to work at Airbnb for another 10 years and him going and starting Coinbase. And that
Yeah.
nudge, according to, my understanding of his story, is he got into Y Combinator, and that was, obviously he had to take the initiative on himself to he was doing the work on the side and starting, the early versions of what would become Coinbase, and then he had to take the initiative to actually apply to Y Combinator and everything like that. But them accepting him, his ability to go and participate in this accelerator was, I think, a nudge that you could argue might have happened 6 months or a year later or 2 years later or whatever. It might have happened anyway, but I don't think you can be sure of that. And so this nudge, I remember him talking about, it was, if nothing else, it was something that he could like show his parents and be like, what I want to do here is
Mhm.
not totally crazy. Like what I want to do here is now signed off by this pretty legit, like at the time it was earlier, Y Combinator wasn't what it is now, but still like pretty legit program. They've signed off, they're giving me money to do it. And that was enough to sort of like get him over the hump to go and do it. And so this has been something like among my top very few interests for that has persisted for 7 or 8 years at this point is how can you have an organization that or some kind of program or whatever that um, sort of systematically provides that nudge for people around the world to go and
Mhm.
and take the leap of faith where they otherwise might not have. And I think if you sort of imagine all people in the world who could do something really great, and like what, an easier way to think about it is just in terms of companies and money because it's like quantifiable. So if you think of like all the potentially great founders out there, who exist and have done the great things that they've done, I think it's reasonable to sort of think that there's kind of a line in the sand somewhere where the people who went and built these great companies had enough, motivation or confidence or a nudge or whatever it might have been to get over that line, to take the leap of faith, to start the thing, and then they ended up being successful.
Mhm.
And there's got to be, I think, if you can basically move that line in the sand to, you're not going to move people necessarily, but if you move the line in the sand, if you can create nudges like
Mhm.
further down, basically, if you're sort of like following the line, then more people are going to take those shots on goal and do things that they're interested in doing that they otherwise might not have the confidence in doing. And so I think at what's going to start as, sort of a micro scale, micro level, both in terms of time and money and people, that's what H Combinator like seems to be to me. It's taking specifically within the higher community or people tangential to the higher community. Like you might have people who had kind of seen about the higher community, and this might actually be
Mhm.
the thing that brings them into it in the first place. But then you're gonna have other people who are very much in the community already, have had ideas of things that they could build, and just haven't yet had the nudge that was
Right.
sort of enough to get them over the line. And so I think H Combinator can definitely be a nudge beyond all the other things that might include, inside of it that can be very helpful for people. I think the nudge alone can make a huge impact, especially when you have a community like Hire, which tends to attract these people with dreams and things that they want to do that they just might be just so very close to like actually going and doing and just haven't done yet. So it'll be really interesting to see like sort of the first class and hear how it goes. And obviously it's an experiment, so it's not like you're not on the
Yeah,
hook
totally.
to continue doing this thing for you'll see how the first one goes and take it one step at a time. But I think the upside for it is something like that it's a nudge for people to, like you said, create their own job, which I think is generally a great thing, for people to be doing. So if
Beautiful.
if you have any, comments on that, I know that was a lot. I'll sort
No,
of
it's
let you have
fine.
a word, but and then I do want to wrap things up with talking about the walking club, just because that's
Yeah.
another completely, you know, off topic from everything we've talked about, but we both seem to have a love for walking and
Yeah,
want to get there as well.
definitely. Yeah, my last bit on H Combinator, you worded it perfectly. Um, you know, within the framework of like internet immaturity, you see so many brilliant minds or people who have a crazy idea and probably have the temperament to actually try it, who, feel that the opportunity has already passed them and that, there's no point in trying things. And that feels like a more workable obstacle to get past than trying to be actually like a Y Combinator with all the funding and things. And so many people when Hire first went up came to me talking about like, oh, they missed it. And you're one of the only people actually that I know of who, in my opinion, did it right in terms of like it was in the valley and then you got in and then, you familiarize yourself with everything. And so I hope that we do what you just outlaid. I hope we're able to tell people like, no, man, this is beginning days of both Hire and the internet at large. Let's try it. Why not? Because Hire is very much, at least now, which I'm proud of, Hire is very receptive to earnest attempts. So it's like let's build off that.
Right. All right. So now is the much anticipated piece
Hmm.
of the conversation on the walking club. What's the deal there? What's your background with walking? Let's talk about walking for a moment.
Yeah. So, the ironically enough, the origins of the walking club are quite existential, as most many things are with me. And I'm down like southeast region, and so I was directly in path of both of those hurricanes that just happened recently. And the first one was actually much worse than the second one, though they were only like a week apart, if that. And it ripped out all these trees and it cut out all the power. And like I said, I have a 93-year-old grandmother, so we're in a bit of a crisis mode. And I just had to start going for walks because it's so hot down here and muggy and there's nothing to do. And my history with walking is pretty much travel based. Like when I would travel is when I'd walk the most, walk cities and see all that. And it always felt good. And then you would hear like brilliant thinkers talk about how, you know, to write best you must walk and all that romance of walking. So it's always been in the back of my head. But when the hurricane came, I really just needed some like respite and I was walking and simultaneously higher stuff was on my mind and stress there. Um, and I just had that like moment of like clarity, that you can get on a walk. And it just had this, I guess, another hook in my mind of I don't really think there's any walking clubs on Farcaster or amongst like all these tech people. Why are we not walking more? Um, and so kind of in a way to make sure I kept walking, I was like, let me create this walking club and let people join and see if it actually gains traction. And there's like 60 or so members, which is not bad for walking around. Um, but it's really just, stay in shape, keep my mind clear, idea generation, a little bit of community that's not related to like building huge networks. Um, and like just it's fun to, I come from athletic backgrounds and all that stuff. It's fun to just put a little proof of walk every once in a while, like, all right, I walked today. So it's just like the more fun, lighthearted side of things.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I joined the channel on Farcaster and the community on Twitter, and I've put like maybe a couple posts in each of I guess when I found myself walking a ton in a given day, it sort of was enough to make me realize I should post this. But my everyday, I'm not posting or anything. And I think one thing that could be interesting, I don't know if you have something planned or not or anything, but is something I was just thinking, should it be active or should it be passive? But something one way or the other that people can like daily log their walks as a part of the
Hmm.
group. And then you can start to have, a number of members, but also like a number of miles walked. And that number can get pretty insane pretty quickly, probably. And the benefit of passive is that like no one has to do anything every day. But if there's just maybe like one action that you have to take, like I think having to take an action every time you walk could be like too much because I mean, it's I could go either way on it. If you have to take an action to like log a walk, then that's not going to capture your non-intentional walks throughout the day, but that could be a
Right.
positive. It's like strictly intentional walks for the sake of walking. Um, but then the passive version is just like going to capture more miles and people don't have to as actively think about it in order to contribute. But regardless, it seems like the seed of something very interesting. And you've got a lot going on now between, hire and
Yeah.
that and a bunch of other things that we haven't gotten to.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about
Um,
Monroe or base colors or any of that.
yeah, exactly. So Monroe is great, by the way. I really
Thank
liked
you.
putting together the nine Monroe in like
That was
that,
beautiful.
that was I really like that. It looks like, if you look at the original art, it like very much matches that. It's colorful. And I think the original that you made was like sort of destined to be, colorable.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
super cool to see that exist. But anyway, I know we've gone long over time. You gave me permission at a couple points throughout, so I figured I could run with it.
Yeah.
And I'm getting into this more of, you know, uh, I used to be my natural inclination is to be hypersensitive to people's time, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And so I would like cut the conversation, at whatever the hour is, like the 59-minute mark, like hard, like no matter what. And I still, I value people's time. I value your time like tremendously. Um, but there's something to having a loose end on a conversation and not having a predetermined stop time.
Yeah,
I'm
totally.
trying to sort of balance that more these days. But anyway, I really appreciate the time. It's been awesome conversation, and we've had some great dialogue in in DMs and on the feed on Farcaster. And this I was going to be very surprised if this would sort of like live up to some of what we've done already, but I think it certainly did. And so it's really enjoyable and excited to share it.
Yeah, music to my ears. Thank you for having me on. I love a good conversation. So if you ever want to have them again, even unrecorded, I'm more than willing. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Perfect. Awesome, man. Well, have a great rest of your day and let's go higher.
Yeah, let's go higher.